This is chapter 14 of Pride and Prejudice. In chapter 13, Mr. Collins comes to visit the Bennets. He is Mr. Bennet's cousin, and he is also the person who is going to inherit Longbourn, the Bennets' house and estate. Chapter 14. During dinner, Mr. Bennet scarcely spoke at all, but when the servants were withdrawn, he thought it time to have some conversation with his guest, and therefore started a subject in which he expected him to shine, by observing that he seemed very fortunate in his patroness. Lady Catherine de Bourgh's attention to his wishes and consideration for his comfort appeared very remarkable. Mr. Bennet could not have chosen better. Mr. Collins was eloquent in her praise. The subject elevated him to more than usual solemnity of manner, and with a most important aspect he protested that he had never in his life witnessed such behavior in a person of rank, such affability and condescension, as he had himself experienced from Lady Catherine. He says that she has affability, which means friendliness, and condescension. In modern contexts, when we say that someone is condescending or that they have condescension, we usually mean that in a very negative way. So we're saying that that person is looking down on others, they're very full of themselves. In Jane Austen's time, that word is sort of shifting meaning to its more modern sense, but it could also mean that someone who is in a high position or had a very, elevated status was helping someone who was in less fortunate circumstances, who had less wealth, perhaps. So when Mr. Collins says that Lady Catherine de Bourgh is condescending, he actually means it in a positive sense that although he is beneath her socially, she is helping him and helping him advance in the world. She had been graciously pleased to approve of both the discourses which he had already had the honor of preaching before her. She had also asked him twice to dine at Rosings, and had sent for him only the Saturday before to make up her pool of quadrille in the evening. Lady Catherine was reckoned proud by many people, he knew, but he had never seen anything but affability in her. She had always spoken to him as she would to any other gentleman. She made not the smallest objection to his joining in the society of the neighborhood, nor to his leaving his parish occasionally for a week or two to visit his relations. She had even condescended to advise him to marry as soon as he could, provided he chose with discretion, and had once paid him a visit in his humble parsonage, where she had perfectly approved all the alterations he had been making, and had even vouchsafed to suggest some herself, some shelves in the closets upstairs. "That is all very proper and civil, I am sure," said Mrs. Bennet, "and I dare say she is a very agreeable woman. It is a pity that great ladies in general are not more like her. Does she live near you, sir? The garden in which stands my humble abode is separated only by a lane from Rosings Park, her lady's residence." "I think you said she was a widow, sir? Has she any family?" "She has one only daughter, the heiress of Rosings, and a very extensive property." "Ah," cried Mrs. Bennet, shaking her head, "then she is better off than many girls. And what sort of young lady is she? Is she handsome?" I think by saying that Miss de Bourgh, Lady Catherine's daughter, is better off than many girls, I think she's sort of hinting at her own daughter's situation. They are not going to inherit property. They don't have that sort of wealth, but this other young lady does. "She's a most charming young lady indeed. Lady Catherine herself says that, in point of true beauty, Miss de Bourgh is far superior to the handsomest of her sex, because there is that in her features which marks the young woman of distinguished birth. She is unfortunately of a sickly constitution, which has prevented her making that progress in many accomplishments which she could not otherwise have failed of, as I am informed by the lady who superintended her education, and who still resides with them. But she is perfectly amiable, and often condescends to drive by my humble abode in her little phaeton and ponies." So Miss de Bourgh, Lady Catherine de Bourgh's daughter, is someone who is somehow sickly. It seems that she had maybe some sort of a childhood illness that has permanently impacted her health, but because of that, she's not able to pursue all of the ladylike accomplishments that would be expected of a Regency-era woman. And if you think back to Mr. Darcy's comments about all the things that an accomplished lady should be, Lady Catherine de Bourgh's daughter is maybe not someone who could do all of those things or who has had the opportunity to pursue all of those things. And he also mentions that a lady who superintended her education. So Miss de Bourgh's governess, so someone who would come to the house and be sort of a live-in teacher, she still lives with them. Has she been presented? I do not remember her name among the ladies at court. Her indifferent state of health unhappily prevents her being in town, and by that means, as I told Lady Catherine myself one day, has deprived the British court of its brightest ornament. Her ladyship seemed pleased with the idea, and you may imagine that I am happy on every occasion to offer those little delicate compliments which are always acceptable to ladies. I have more than once observed to Lady Catherine that her charming daughter seemed born to be a duchess, and that the most elevated rank, instead of giving her consequence, would be adorned by her. These are the kind of little things which please her ladyship, and it is a sort of attention which I conceive myself peculiarly bound to pay. You judge very properly, said Mr. Bennet, and it is happy for you that you possess a talent of flattering with delicacy. May I ask whether these pleasing attentions proceed from the impulse of the moment, or are the result of previous study? They arise chiefly from what is passing at the time, and though I sometimes amuse myself with suggesting and arranging such little elegant compliments as may be adapted to ordinary occasions, I always wish to give them as unstudied an air as possible. Mr. Bennet's expectations were fully answered. His cousin was as absurd as he had hoped, and he listened to him with the keenest enjoyment, maintaining at the same time the most resolute composure of countenance, and, except in an occasional glance at Elizabeth, requiring no partner in his pleasure. So Mr. Collins mentions that he likes to pay compliments to women. He complimented Miss de Bourgh in the past, and this seems sort of odd to Mr. Bennet that he, makes this generalization that, all ladies love my compliments. So Mr. Bennet asks him with this sort of I always picture or imagine a sly tone, are these things that you think of spontaneously in the moment, or are these things that you've planned out ahead of time? And Mr. Collins says, well, they usually come from whatever's happening at the time, but, I have some, compliments prepared that can apply to any situation. So he, comes up with his compliments ahead of time. Mr. Bennet's expectations of him being a little bit ridiculous and very strange are completely met. While he's thinking all of these things, though, he's keeping a very stoic face. He's not reacting to any of this. The only thing that he's doing is sharing a glance with Elizabeth every now and again, sort of just suggesting, isn't this guy a little bit much? By tea time, however, the dose had been enough, and Mr. Bennet was glad to take his guest into the drawing-room again, and when tea was over, glad to invite him to read aloud to the ladies. Mr. Collins readily assented, and a book was produced, but on beholding it, for everything announced it to be from a circulating library, he started back, and begging pardon, protested that he never read novels. Kitty stared at him, and Lydia exclaimed. Other books were produced, and after some deliberation he chose Fordyce's Sermons. Lydia gaped as he opened the volume, and before he had, with very monotonous solemnity, read 3 pages, she interrupted him with, Do you know, Mamma, that my Uncle Phillips talks of turning away Richard? And if he does, Colonel Forster will hire him. My aunt told me so herself on Saturday. I shall walk to Meryton tomorrow to hear more about it, and to ask when Mr. Denny comes back from town. So Mr. Collins is going to read to everyone. He first finds a book that is a novel. In Jane Austen's time, novels didn't always have the most well-respected reputation. They were kind of considered to be a lower form of literature. People considered some of the plots to be a little bit sensational, and they weren't always considered moral books. Mr. Collins, because he's a preacher, is all about the morals. So he doesn't want to read that. He picks up a book of sermons. Apparently it's very boring. And after reading a couple of pages, Lydia interrupts him with this piece of gossip. Lydia was bid by her 2 eldest sisters to hold her tongue. But Mr. Collins, much offended, laid aside his book and said, I have often observed how little young ladies are interested by books of a serious stamp, though written solely for their benefit. It amazes me, I confess, for certainly there can be nothing so advantageous to them as instruction. But I will no longer importune my young cousin. Then, turning to Mr. Bennet, he offered himself as his antagonist at backgammon. Mr. Bennet accepted the challenge, observing that he acted very wisely in leaving the girls to their own trifling amusements. Mrs. Bennet and her daughters apologized most civilly for Lydia's interruption, and promised that it should not occur again if he would resume his book. But Mr. Collins, after assuring them that he bore his young cousin no ill will and should never resent her behavior as any affront, seated himself at another table with Mr. Bennet and prepared for backgammon. So it ends with Mr. Bennet and Mr. Collins just playing a game together because Lydia has really offended him. And that's chapter 14.